This week, we're talking about a literary legend of the science fiction world, William Gibson. Why is he so influential? And if you haven't read any of his work, how can you get into it? And then we're going to force William Gibson to fly all the way down from Vancouver just to shoot the breeze with us and talk about the future. This episode of We Come From the Future is brought to you by Audible.com. Welcome to We Come From the Future, the show where we only read books with shiny foil covers on them. And if they don't have shiny covers, we wrap them in tinfoil. I'm Annalee Newitz.
And I'm Esther Inglis-Arkell. This show is all about William Gibson. Annalee has read his stuff. I really haven't. Somehow I missed out. What's so great about this guy, Annalee? Tell a novice.
So he's one of the most famous writers to emerge from the cyberpunk scene that was really active in science fiction in the 1970s and 80s. And his first book, Neuromancer, is the first place where you've ever seen the word cyberspace in science fiction. He invented the term, he invented the idea of jacking into cyberspace with a jack in your head. And so he's kind of hailed as one of those few science fiction writers who actually got the future right. Not about so much the jacking in, but his descriptions of cyberspace really resemble the web today.
Okay, but that means it's kind of the present now. If I wanted to dip my toe into the vast and stormy ocean, which is William Gibson's body of work, where would I start?
I think you probably do want to start with Neuromancer. That's one of his most famous books. It's from his first trilogy, which is called the Sprawl Trilogy. Mm-hmm. And then he has a couple other trilogies which get closer and closer to being set in the present day. Huh. So his second trilogy, the Bridge Trilogy, is set in a very near future San Francisco after there's been a terrible disaster that we don't really understand. And then his latest trilogy, which is called the Blue Ant Trilogy, has one of my favorite books of his in it called Pattern Recognition. And that's all about the secret connection between viral marketing online and international espionage. So Gibson is just really great at connecting disparate things and showing you how they really fit together.
How about his nonfiction?
So he has written a bunch of essays. His new book, Distrust That Particular Flavor, is out now, and that collects his essays together. And he does talk a lot about technologies of the future in those essays, so that's pretty interesting too.
Sort of makes you wonder what kind of guy would think like that. Let's bring him in and make him tell us.
I'm here with the celebrated science fiction author William Gibson, who invented the term cyberspace back in the 1980s and hasn't been allowed to forget it since that time. So thanks for coming into the studio and chatting with us today.
Always a pleasure.
So you're here. He's on tour right now for his book of essays called Distrust That Particular Flavor. And one of the things that you talk about in this book, actually in a number of different essays, is the fact that you're pretty comfortable with the idea that science fiction, even when it's about the future, is really about the present. What can you say about the present in a book about the future that you couldn't say in a book about the present?
There is a theoretical function of fiction associated with the birth of the novel. And the Goncourt brothers and their idea of literary naturalism. And that is something that I've always found very interesting, the reportorial possibilities of long form fiction. And when people do that in my experience, when people do that with contemporary reality in my lifetime, it bores me to death.
Do you think it's easier to write about the present when you've set yourself somewhat into the future or somewhat into the past? Or because you've just had this experience of doing 3 books that are pretty emphatically set right in the now?
Well, actually, those 3 books are very deliberately set in the year prior to their actual publication.
Mm-hmm. So slightly in the past.
They're speculative novels of the very recent past, mm-hmm. or they were on the day.
So alternate history that's 5 minutes into the past.
Yeah, very short very short-term alternate history. The reason I began to do that, just in terms of the shape of my career, I now think, looking back on it, is that by the time I got to the end of All Tomorrow's Parties, I had become painfully self-conscious through this feeling that my yardstick for the weirdness of the moment was an 80s yardstick. It was like it was too old. My idea of extreme weirdness wasn't enough. And I didn't have any sense of where the weirdness of that now was. And that really worried me. And I thought, well, maybe I can't do this sort of thing at all. But what I found in the course of writing those three most recent books is that it's given me my yardstick. Like, I know how weird it is. It's okay, it's as weird as those three books. That's the now. And in order to do the future thing, I've got the yardstick. So I just say, okay, this is now, and the future is like this.
So you've recalibrated.
Yeah, I've recalibrated. And in fact, I'm writing a book that's set in at least two futures simultaneously right now, one of which is quite recognizable, and the other, I hope, will be almost incomprehensible.
So what can you tell us about the futures that you're portraying in this new novel? Are they two alternate futures? Are they one after the other?
I can't reveal its ravishing coolness, particularly prior to having written it.
I wonder if you feel like the present is becoming more futuristic again.
In my lifetime, I don't think the present has ever not been madly futuristic. Mm-hmm. I mean, occasionally, as a culture, there's a way we kind of get used to it and kind of go, oh, yeah, iPads, yeah.
Gene therapy, whatever.
Yeah, whatever. Yeah, we get used to it, but I think that's just some kind of organic survival response to the howling wind tunnel of technologically driven change we've been forced down through my whole life now. It never stops. If we're lucky, it never stops.
One of the things that a number of science fiction writers have been thinking about lately, partly I think spurred by Neil Stephenson's ideas about writing optimistic science fiction, has been trying to create works that are self-consciously encouraging people to think about the future in constructive or positive ways. And I can tell from your kind of eye rolling that you're like, how could you? Do you ever think about that? Do you ever think like, okay, I want to write something that helps people think, that they could have a future where... Well,
actually, in spite of my eye rolling, I thought when I wrote Neuromancer that I was doing this like ludicrously optimistic science fictional thing, because when I wrote Neuromancer, anybody with half a brain woke up every day with consciousness that could be the humanity's last day. Everybody who knew what was going on in the world, I just took that for granted, because the U.S. and the USSR were sitting there with umpty billion nukes pointed at each other, and actual live humans with the controllers watching radar screens. I mean, in Tiptree's last couple of years, her letters are filled with this terrible, grinding resignation she and all of her friends in the CIA felt the impending end of the world. Mm-hmm. So, and I went through my childhood was very colored by that stuff. And it was still going on in 1981 when I started publishing fiction. And there didn't really seem to be any end in sight. The drying up and blowing away of the Soviet Union wasn't in sight yet. And so the future of Neuromancer and those early short stories was to some very real extent created to depict a world that had a little bit of a nuclear war, and something had happened, probably the corporations just said, no, wait, you can't make it, we're not making any money, you can't do that anymore.
You can't make money if people are dead.
Yeah, that's over. And consequently, you can't prove that the United States still exists as a political entity in Neuromancer. It seems to be some sort of system of city-states. But where I wasn't prescient, as I so often am not, the Soviet Union looms in the background, this like huge heap of slag, which is too big to fail. Mm-hmm. And so I missed that. If I'd gotten that right, people would have burned me as a witch eventually.
So it sounds like you feel that writing about a future where humans are still around is itself a kind of optimism, basically.
Yeah, I really think it is. I don't know. I'm a little uncomfortable with the idea of the novelist as a vehicle for boosterism, because my idea of what good novels do is to go out and read the signs and come back and make something in their image. And the signs aren't always very good. Yeah, I don't know. I've never been a fan of didactic fictions. And I would assume that morale-boosting science fiction would necessarily be didactic.
Yes, you start out with a message.
In some sense. Although, then you can there could be an alternative morale-boosting science fiction that doesn't necessarily depict futures that the dominant status quo today would be comforted seeing depicted. I mean, one man's dystopia is another man's paradise.
So what can you tell us about the Neuromancer film?
I'm quite good friends with the putative director, Vincenzo Natali, and I'm a big fan of his work. But beyond that, I don't like to talk about other people's work in progress. Mm-hmm. And the history of the different films of Neuromancer, one could write a book, a terrible book, a book of terrible stories. But I would say that, it's still at the point where anything you hear, unless you should one day miraculously hear it from me, is just noise. Like when people are trying to get these things going, they make noise. So they're out there like crying across the primordial swamps of the film industry, trying to attract another entity that will make it all mean something. Mm-hmm. And I have a little more way of interpreting them than anyone else does. But I mean, it both touches me and horrifies me to see the ease with which people jump, seemingly, at least on Twitter, to the absolute conviction that, yes, now this is going to happen. But that said, it seems to me that it's in a better position to happen now than it has been before. So I suppose that's progress.
Yeah. Awesome. Cool. All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
The book that is out now in paperback is Distrust That Particular Flavor. And on that note, a word from our sponsor. Audible.com is the leading provider of downloadable digital audiobooks and spoken word entertainment. Choose from books in every genre: science fiction, thrillers, drama, comedy, business, history, and more. One great pick is William Gibson's latest book, Distrust That Particular Flavor. Of course, there's over 100,000 titles to choose from. With audiobooks from audible.com, reading is convenient and fun whether you're commuting to work or flying to the other side of the world. Go to audiblepodcast.com/future to get a free audiobook. Download your choice when you sign up today. Again, go to audiblepodcast.com/future for your free audiobook. If you want to see more of us, remember to find us on iTunes by searching for IO9.
And please, please subscribe to us on YouTube by clicking here.
And remember, when you're jacked into cyberspace, you can see us next week in the future.